Story 1. A dead body was found floating in the water. The crew managed to get it onto a stretcher, double-bagged it, placed it in the freezer, and then handed it over to the local authorities at the next port visit. I played a role in that process. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition, but there was enough remaining to allow for identification by dental records. This provided some closure for the family. Story 2. The weirdest thing I've seen by far is coming out of a fog bank and seeing thousands of giant red Humboldt squid with their tentacles waving in the air. It was surreal and something I will never forget, like a bunch of little aliens. Story 3. We were cruising in the Bahamas one night in the Devil's Triangle. All of a sudden, we heard this chain dragging down the hull for like a minute, just scraping. It was unnerving, and it was in Exuma Sound, which is like thousands of feet deep, which means it would have been floating and hanging off the bottom of something, like an old mine drifting for years. We came about to try and find it, but we could never find it again. It just disappeared. Another time, we were under the polar ice cap, and the ice sheet moans all the time, like what you think a mermaid siren would sound like. And sometimes you can hear it through the hull, for about 65 days straight, non-stop. The North Pole is absolutely the quietest place you can ever be, and in November, it has this fog that's always there. You can't tell how far anything is away. It gets very unnerving after a while. Story 4. We responded to a sailboat that was taking on water. It became clear that the sailboat wasn't going to make it. We brought the crew of the sailboat onto our vessel, and then we sort of waited around and watched the sailboat sink. What struck me is how silent it was. No fuss, no drama. It wasn't like a dark and stormy night or anything. It was a picture-perfect day. Glassy ocean with not a cloud in the sky, and it didn't matter. It was the kind of day that most seafarers dream about, and yet these folks had been in a fight for their lives, trying to keep their boat afloat. After it sank, there were a few bubbles, and then that was it. You'd have never known there was ever a sailboat there. Just a beautiful day without a trace of struggle. Sailboat? What sailboat? Around here, I didn't see a sailboat. Story 5. I was on a night dive. It was a dive site I was familiar with, and as is common practice, the captain had fixed a steady strobe light to the anchor line of the boat so we could find our way back. As I was readying to complete my dive and ascend, I wondered why the strobe was no longer blinking and now just a steady beam. Looking at my compass, I was doubly confused by how I had gotten my navigation so wrong. I felt foolish. Had I been cocky and overexcited because I was comfortable with this site? How could I have miscalculated my direction so? It is a dangerous mistake at any time for a diver, much more so at night. But as I was ascending, the brightness of the light really irked me. Why would the captain change the strobe on us? Was something wrong? Then it hit me. I was not swimming toward the boat at all. I was swimming toward the moon. The water was so clear and calm, I had mistaken it for a light. Luckily, I had not ascended fully and was not too far off. I was able to redirect to my original navigation, eventually finding the strobe, the boat, and a renewed respect for the ocean's ability to make you second-guess yourself. Story 6. While standing on a bridge watching the Mediterranean in 1996, probably 50 miles north of Tunisia, at 2 a.m., something came down from the sky in a streak and exploded, and it was absolute daylight for a few seconds. It was bright enough that we were seriously concerned that a nuclear explosion had happened. It was probably just a big meteorite or something exploding, but it was something to see. The same year, we were conducting very slow survey lines in the Mediterranean, moving at 1.5 knots with absolutely nothing around us or on radar, when a flare went off directly in front of us. We found out later that it was a submarine that had kindly included us in war games and was letting us know that we were dead. Story 7. I saw something that appeared very serpentine and huge, undulating in the waves of our wake on a very dark, cloudy night en route from Florida to New York City. It was glowing faintly green just underneath the surface and appeared to be some sort of huge fat snake swimming alongside us with a 1.5-foot diameter body. It was mesmerizing, trying to rationalize what I was looking at. Later, I realized it was just a dolphin playing in our wake, whose undulating body and wake were lit up by bioluminescent plankton. Story 8. Another ship that was miles away looked like you could reach out and touch it. It is an optical phenomenon I have seen many times, to varying degrees. School of thousands of hammerhead sharks all swimming in the same direction. A whale swimming along that was half-eaten. Being in storms where seas were tall and thinking back on wooden ships in the past traversing through such storms always weirded me out a bit. Story 9. Doing an underway replenishment. There was a standing wave about 15 to 20 feet tall between the ships. Dolphins were jumping out of the top of the wave and flipping and twirling in the air. Story 10. I once took a long passage on a merchant ship. Watching a corridor below decks twist and bend as the ship, that looks so solid in port, is tossed by waves, is definitely up there. But I only had a film still camera then, so no way to show it. Story 11. Running dark on a ship in the middle of the ocean, you could look in any direction, besides down and see stars. I couldn't see my hand an inch from my face, but I could see stars that seemed to be just above the water on the horizon. It was like a dome of stars. It made me feel very small and insignificant. Story 12. Research vessel in the early 90s, about 200 miles off of South Carolina. We could hold position within a few dozen meters using a satellite system that predates GPS, so we stayed parked for days at a time. Sargasso seaweed would drift past us on its way to Europe. One time, the bridge called out an oil slick that turned out to be a pod of killer whales drifting past, about to pass half a mile or so, off the port side. Before the slick came alongside, 2 whales came over and patrolled stem to stern, maybe 30 feet off of the port rail, while the rest of the pod stayed with their kill. About when the kill was even with us, 2 more whales came and patrolled with the first 2, taking 2 complete laps altogether. Then the first 2 left to rejoin the lunch party, while the new squad stayed with us. After a while, those 2 left and we never saw any of them again. At no time did they go to the starboard side, and they never went far beyond the ends of our ship. It was an organized guard patrol. Their message was very clear, and no one denied that we had been warned off. We never did figure out what was on the menu, but it was large enough to form a huge oil slick. Story 13. Neither terribly eerie nor technically at sea, but I was involved as crew sailing from Chicago to Mackinac Island on Lake Michigan. This is big enough that you can't see land if you're in the middle. It's a freshwater sea in some sense. The boat was, shall we say, not well maintained, so our lights were out, and the GPS had packed it in, though there was a handheld if we needed it. The compass was also way off, so I had the guy with the GPS read our track off until I was set for where we needed to be, looked up and spotted the North Star Polaris at a point in the rigging and just kept it there all night. I told the next watch to just sleep in since I was in the groove, and it was magic. We sailed a perfect course until dawn. In summary, sailed a good course by the stars all night, a magical experience. Story 14. I was working on a pearl boat for around 18 months on the Aerofora Sea a few years ago, and one of my roles was keeping watch in the wheelhouse. Essentially, you make sure the boat is following the preset path on the navigation, and if it strays, you turn it manually to keep it within the course set. My watch was from 4 to 8 a.m. About 7 a.m., I noticed a white cube perhaps 200 meters port side, hard to say with no point of reference, but it didn't show up on the navigation/radar system we had that let you plot/recognize boats. It was also not bobbing up and down with the waves. It was just sitting there on the waterline in the distance. I got a better look at it with the binoculars, and it was so strange seeing this white cube just sit still there on the sea in the distance. It wasn't really hovering above it, but as the waves moved with the ocean, every now and again I could see the bottom of it, which is how I know it was a cube. Again, it's hard to say without a point of reference at sea, but I'm guessing it was the size of a van. I'm purely going off how big things appear in the binoculars when looking at things I do know how big they are. The person who was following my shift came to drop me a coffee, and he saw it too, so I know it wasn't just me being tired. Following this, a few years later, I saw when the Tic Tac videos came out from the Pentagon, and some of the fighter pilots said they saw 5-shaped objects floating in the sky. Story 15. I am a submariner. I was a sonar technician, and we were out on a mission with the towed arrays deployed. We were deep and detected a couple of biological entities like shrimp and whales. It was quiet for about 20 minutes after we passed them. Suddenly, we heard a screeching noise like metal on metal. We thought we had collided with another submarine. The whole crew went to battle stations and woke up our subject matter expert, SME, passengers to determine what that noise was. This noise continued for about 5 minutes, coming and going. It sounded like a song when you started to replay it. The whole incident was recorded, but the acting crew couldn't determine what it was, nor could the sonar chief. A message was sent out when we went to Periscope Depth, PD, and the recording was sent to our squadron and the Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, once we docked. I do not know what happened afterwards, but apparently, the Navy regularly collects these types of recordings. From what we could tell, the source was close and almost as large as the submarine. We couldn't tell if it was a biological entity or another submarine. There were no screw noises or indication of water displacement. And no, we didn't hit anything. Story 16. I never spent long stretches at sea, but when I was a teenager in the early 80s, I hired on as crew on a trolling boat. I still remember the absolute awe and bit of terror the first time we went into ocean waters. It wasn't stormy or even bad weather, but just the ground swell was enormous enough that when you were at the bottom, you couldn't see the other boats or land. Just giant walls of water on either side of you. Incredibly humbling. Story 17. My father was a lobsterman. I spent a lot of time on the boat with him throughout my childhood and teens. When I was about 10, I recall fishing for bait, using lines with multiple lures thrown over the side and hauled back up. When the sea was clear and calm, you would see the fish on the line as you brought it in, flashes of silver in the blue. Occasionally, there would be a big dark shape and one of your fish wouldn't be there afterward. This didn't worry me until the day this happened at the waterline, and I watched a 10-foot blue shark turn sideways and stare me right in the eye as it stole a mackerel off the hook. The image has never left me. I watched Jaws at too early an age, I think. Story 18. One of my first few trips out on a West Coast trawler. I was in the wheelhouse and the weather wasn't bad, but birds kept showing up and trying to sneak into the inner parts of the boat. Apparently, they tried to get inside to shelter from storms. Later that night, I was almost hurled from my bunk and was told someone broke their neck once from the same thing. Also, an overworked engineer was using a shop vacuum to handle water flooding. Being at sea reminds me of how many of our industries used to be crazy dangerous, and that many of them still are, but you don't realize it when you aren't in it. I was regularly a solid 22 hours from emergency services. If something bad happens, it's up to the others present if you survive. And I was constantly thinking about if you fall into the ocean without a survival suit, it takes about 8 minutes for hypothermia to overwhelm you, which is also shorter than many boats can turn around to try and get you. Story 19. My dad's story. He was an engineer on merchant ships. This happened one night during the 1960s. He was sailing with a Chinese crew. They liked to put the ship's arc lights on and go night fishing. One night, he heard them making a commotion on deck and went to look. Just at the edge of the light was a long rippling thing, about 50 feet long. It moved for several minutes, then just disappeared. The crew were very excited by it. I now suspect it was an oarfish, but we will never know for certain. Story 20. We were around some islands in the South Pacific. Saw a guy, one lone person, floating in the middle of the water on some kind of inner tube or life ring. He hailed us and asked us to stop and bring him aboard because he had been shipwrecked. Our captain, having not been born yesterday, offered to throw him a rope instead. We will happily tow you over to the open water and then welcome you aboard. The guy scowled and just said, "Never mind then. Don't stop around islands in pirated waters, folks." Story 21. Rogue wave out of nowhere on 35-foot boat with tuna tower. Look up and just see a wall of water. Came crashing down. So much water, I thought the boat had capsized, and I was underwater. It bent the metal on the tuna tower. The pressure broke all the windows. Then, nothing. Back to a normal day. Story 22. I was out at sea on an auxiliary oil replenishment, essentially a merchant ship that supplies fuel and other supplies to Navy ships. We were out in December in the North Atlantic. We were plowing into swells large enough that the spray from the bow was hitting the windows of the bridge. The bridge is 6 decks up and 400 feet aft of the bow. Anyhow, we were pounding through it. You could hear the whole 27,000-ton ship groaning and shuddering every time we hit a swell. Then the watertight door alarm went off for the door that leads from the cargo section out onto the deck. Taking water into the dry cargo well through that hatch would have been very, very bad. In the end, thankfully, the alarm was caused because the ocean removed the sensor, not because there was a problem with the door. Story 23. About halfway between Hawaii and California, we, the bridge team on a United States Navy ship, saw a stationary, perfectly straight line almost 20 miles long on surface search radar. At first, we thought it was an issue with the radar systems. As we approached, we didn't see anything unusual. It was a clear day. No other vessels were in sight. Only when we approached within a few hundred yards could we see choppy water with 1 to 2 foot chaotic waves in a perfectly straight line about 20 yards across, with a distinct border separating it from an otherwise calm, almost glassy sea. The line extended in both directions as far as we could see. The straightness was what was most eerie to us. We measured the ocean surface temperature outside the zone and within it and noted a 2-degree Fahrenheit difference. The choppy water was colder. We passed through the zone without incident.